And I see that everybody somehow either walked from home or found this space somewhere, and we're delighted that you did. What a wonderful crowd. Mallory Arentz and I, Elisa Kaplan, are very happy to welcome you tonight. We do a lot of joint programming, and we're happy that you're here for this one, and perhaps you'll join us for something else. You know, it's still November, and we're all pretty busy, and you're going to see all the great things that are happening at Darien Library, very easy to see on their website. You could go to the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County website to see our great things, but we've handed out a flyer about our event, Pioneers of Education, and you're all most welcome to join us on December 10th. We also have on December 13th, we have a book talk with Richard Schwartz, local guy, and Yael Stolarsky, our Israeli emissary, who are speaking about Hebrew poetry. So they're going to be talking about freedom poetry, because in only a few days it's going to be Hanukkah. I'd like to wish you happy Hanukkah. And a few days after that, it's going to be Christmas. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to all of you. And it's still only November 30th. Okay, so if you like this program, you might want to join us in January. We won't be here with Mallory, but maybe Mallory will join us that day. We have The Star of the Son of Saul, which is a pretty tough movie, and his name is Geza Rorig, and he'll be here actually from Hungary, and he's going to be talking about making the movie and what it was like in his life, and so that's going to be at Temple Israel in Westport, and it's going to be on Martin Luther King weekend, which maybe most of you, if you're smart, you'll be in Florida. Okay. So those are some of our commercials. We have passed out membership forms, or we have some membership forms. And Leah, where are you?
I'm right here.
Right. And so, at the end, if anyone is interested in finding out more about our historical society, please see our vice president, Leah Tillman. And a special thanks to my co-partner in crime, Marcy Schoenfeld, who is here in Phantom, because she's helping her sister with surgery, but she's usually here working with Mallory. So we are delighted always to be here at the Darien Library. It's a lovely setting, and but it's more than that. It's always that after you leave the Darien Library, you just feel really smart. And it's a pleasure, Mallory, to work with you. Mallory is the head of adult programming, and she says that she loves books, but she likes people even more. Is that right? And and you can see that by tonight. But she's going to explain to me later what these things are. K-pop. I know what vegan is. I can eat vegan myself if I, want to do that. And cephalopods. You really into the octopus family? Okay, that's what you're going to ask her about on the way out.
She read my bio on the website.
That's right. Well, I do know how to do research. And we are all in for a real treat tonight with Larissa Bailiff, whom Mallory is going to introduce, because she is combining what you do with your mind in a very enjoyable way, and using technology and using all of her many skills. And she used to work at the Morgan Library, which is one of our hot spots. So I'm going to turn this over to Mallory, but I'm also going to pass around a sign-in sheet, and if you choose to sign in, that would be great. And so enjoy the evening. Oh, wait, I have one other thing that we have to do really, really, really fast. I forgot. We have to... Larissa's great speaker, but we want to. I'm here to do the warm-up for the crowd, okay? So get your thumbs up. Okay, upward, and now go down. Okay, so I have the top 10 list of Jewish artists, okay? So give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down for Pissarro.
Are we voting for one?
Voting. No, you can go for all of them. Okay. Frida.
Oh, yeah.
You like her? How about that little-known guy, Marc Chagall?
Yeah.
Okay. Roy Lichtenstein? I actually had to look him up. Okay. Did you know that Rube Goldberg?
With a name like that?
I know, like, who is that person? How about Annie Leibovitz? Okay, Lee Krasner, married to Jackson Pollock, right? Frank Gehry, he's the Guggenheim and all that, yeah, okay. And one of my personal favorites, Saul LeWitt. Okay, but number 10, let's see how you like this one. Amedeo Modigliani. Okay, Mallory, take it. Last thing. I keep saying last thing. I am the Columbo of introductions. So, Larissa Bailiff, this is a one-year membership to the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. Just fill out your name and address. Okay, I'm passing out, and I'm passing around a sign-in sheet, and if please do this for us. Thank you so much. Mallory, take it away.
I wish I was that funny. Well, I've got some few announcements on our end. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Mallory Ahrens. I'm the head of adult programming here at Darien Library. It's my great honor to welcome you into our community room this evening. Thank you for battling the traffic in the parking lot, which I'm sure was no fun, to spend your evening with us. This afternoon, Mia is our teen librarian, and she shared with me that a teenage boy said to her this afternoon in the teen lounge, "Did you know the artist who is visiting the library tonight," that's the first thing, "had a piece of artwork in the new movie It?" So all that being said, he is not here with us this evening, but even teenagers are excited about Modigliani, which I thought was pretty cute. So in case you haven't seen the newest It film, I guess there's a piece that is inspired by one of his. So that's your fun fact brought to you by a teenager in Darien. I'm thrilled to welcome back to the library one of our favorite art historians. She's a specialist in modern French art and social history, formerly an associate educator at MoMA. She continues to offer tours and courses at the museum. For the last 3 years, she has worked for Boulevard Arts, an immersive arts technology company where she creates cultural content for virtual and mixed reality platforms. Please join me in welcoming back to the library Larissa Bailiff.
Thank you so much. Wait. No? Yes? Yes, it's on.
We're adjusting.
One
Try
second. Okay, perfect, right? Okay. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for these introductions. I'm so excited to be back at Darien and speaking to you about Modigliani, one of my favorite artists, and I hope he's one of your favorite artists, or by the end is one of your favorite artists. Obviously, he's a popular topic, and he was popular in his own day among his friends, and we'll talk about that, and we'll talk about many, many themes. He only lived 35 years. We don't want to kill him off just yet, but even with that short life, there is so much to discuss. So I will sort of focus in on some particular themes and tell some anecdotes and show you way too many slides. So I hope that works for us. And I think they're going to dim the lights in just a second. But I wanted to follow up on the notion of Mallory loving books, but loving people more. And I want to say I love art, but I love people more. So thank you for letting me do what I really enjoy doing, which is sharing art, communicating about it, and learning from all of you. So, great. Fantastic. Okay. Make sure we'll see if this works. So here we start with, hands down, he's gorgeous. I'm sorry, but he's gorgeous. And that was part of his lore. Amedeo Modigliani, Italian born, a Sephardic Jew. We'll talk more about that. But here he is in about 1912, sort of very cavalier, looking very sort of aristocratic, even in his impoverished state in Paris there, sort of addressing us. And this is what we would have experienced of Modigliani in Paris. A very congenial person, an intellectual, as we'll talk about. And everyone sort of saw something aristocratic about him. And again, no little sort of attraction. I've titled this Amedeo Modigliani, A Global Kaleidoscope, and we'll talk about why I sort of framed it that way. I was inspired by two exhibitions that are up right now, and I hope that if you haven't seen it yet, there's a wonderful focus show at the Jewish Museum called Modigliani Unmasked, and it's up through February 4th, so you have no excuse. So please go if you haven't. It is mostly drawings. There are some paintings and some sculptures mixed in, and it focuses particularly on if one can say this with a short-lived artist, the early career of Modigliani in Paris, and the collection of Paul Alexandre, who was an early patron of the artist, close in age, a doctor who became a patron of Modigliani. So check that out, and that gives us a sort of taste, I know that's a dark slide, of some of his imagery and the fact that he works in multimedia. To the bottom part of the slide there's a wonderful show, which I haven't seen yet, and I hope to make it over to Europe, but hopefully you can if I can't, and that is a show entitled Modigliani, and it is an exhibition of his works, particularly paintings. We see one of his nudes here, for which, of course, he's very, very well known for the genre of the nude, and actually speaking to my technology pursuits right now, unfortunately not my company, Boulevard Arts, but another company, HTC Vive, that produces virtual technology for other fields, actually created a simulation of Modigliani's studio. So they spent 5 months researching and built it so that if you go over to the Tate, one at a time, you can go into a space and be immersed in a studio. So, but I say look at the paintings first. That's the most important. And what I want to do today in our whirlwind of time together is to bring us into Modigliani's studio, not in an immersive way through virtual reality, but through our discussion, through slides, through our understanding of his world, particularly after he moves to Paris and lives in Montparnasse. Impoverished, feverishly working, and inspired by his friends and inspiring them. And we'll talk about this sort of global perspective and what that meant to him in terms of the idea of forging his identity and promoting his identity. So there he is, looking out at us. But we have to start at the beginning, right? So we have a few pictures there of his parents, Eugenia Garson and Flaminio Modigliani. And they had met, or they were married in Livorno and lived there. That's where Amedeo was born. But Eugenia, though part of her family was Italian, had been raised in Marseille, France. So she was fluent in French, which later stood her in good stead because she became a language teacher when the family fell on hard times. But she could speak French and Italian. Her father could speak French, Italian, Spanish, Greek, and some Arabic as well. So the Garcin family were very cultivated, very educated. They weren't of well means, but they were well-traveled, and they could trace their roots back to Spain and philosophers such as Spinoza, and their discussions were full of intellectual conversation, banter, and understanding. So Modigliani, Amedeo that is, grew up in a family that was immersed in reading and literature and philosophical debate. So I want us to have that sort of underpinning and not just think that he was only about art. All of this informed who he was. The Modiglianis were better at business and not so cultivated or educated, at least as Eugenia would say when she went to Livorno to marry Flaminio. And he was a much older husband. Their marriage doesn't seem to have been particularly happy, but they had several children together. Unfortunately, by their fourth child, when Amedeo came into the world, his last child, in 1884, the family had gone bankrupt. So the Modiglianis had business all over Italy, but unfortunately, they had promised dowries to other members of the Modigliani family, and loans were called in, and the family was bankrupt. at the point that Amedeo, or Dado as he was called by his mother, was born. Forgive me, sorry. I was thinking about the economics here. But what I want to tell you is, and we see the young Amedeo there, I'm thinking about commercial transactions because I feel Eugenia's pain in terms of this, saying, I'm having my fourth child. Do you really have to go bankrupt just at this moment? And we see the house in which he was born there. But there was an interesting law in Livorno, perhaps all throughout Italy, which stated that a family could keep from the collectors anything that was on the bed where the child and while the mother was giving birth. And so one can imagine that they picked the biggest bed while the collectors were coming and literally taking furniture and silver and everything away from the family. They piled up a table. Apparently Modigliani was born on a table. And you can imagine, again, Eugenia's pain and struggle as they're putting every treasure that they have. But that sort of saved the family. And later they had better means, but it was never very easy after that. But this is sort of, as Dado came into the world, was he cursed? Later on, he'll be called, his French friends will sort of refer to him as Modi, sort of a play on, M-O-D-I, but the idea of Maudi, M-A-U-D-I, cursed, tragic, right? I don't want to put all of that on him, but it wasn't easy when he came into this world. But what I will say is that he was considered the golden child of the family. His mother doted on him and taught him and took him to art museums and gave Modi, or Dado as she called him, everything that she could. So I'm going to keep us going there, but there you can see, attractive from the beginning, and that never changed, sort of culling attention, if you will. Apparently, within a year and a half, they were wealthy enough to have a nurse, so things weren't too bad. It wasn't Lux at this point, but there he is. And I don't have any pictures of him. I could have brought in some as he's sort of in childhood, but I want to say that not only was he treated as the kind of celebrated, spoiled child as best his mother could do, but there's an interesting statement that she makes he's around the age of 10. She says, I'm so curious, I wonder, what's going to come of this little chrysalis? What will emerge from it? Perhaps an artist. So she knew from the fact that he was drawing and that he was creative and imaginative spirit. But again, I want us to keep thinking about this as an artist who was compelled from early on and drawing and talented, but an artist who grew up learning the classics, and who, when he was in France, could quote Dante verbatim. And I'm not talking read, I'm talking could quote verbatim. Or Mallarmé, or any of the others, could talk Spinoza and philosophy, etc. So what was he exposed to in Italy? I'm just going to throw some of these things at us so that as we look at later pictures, we might sort of think about these things. So, of course, he's steeped in Renaissance painting, and while he's born in Livorno, he eventually goes to Florence as a teenager to study art. Somebody comes up with enough money, and eventually he's on a kind of stipend from a well-to-do uncle, so he's able to pursue his art. But we might think about wonderful nudes from the Renaissance by Giorgione, later Titian, etc. The sort of beautiful coloration, the sensuality, the line. Or other works by Botticelli, and here we just have a detail of Primavera, or we might know The Birth of Venus, but these works from during the late 15th century, and also for Mannerist works. So that elegant line, the attenuated forms, I want us to see this as being his kind of bread and butter that he is raised on. And also here, one Mannerist work, or a late Renaissance work, and those are characterized by, this Eleanor of Toledo example, characterized by elongated, attenuated fingers, oval faces. Everything is distorted and accentuated and aristocratic and made more elegant. So we'll see this sort of brought to bear and mixed with Modigliani's other sources. The reason why I wanted to call this a global kaleidoscope is to have us think about the ways in which lots of modern artists, the avant-garde, were mixing different sources, but Modigliani, more than most, was culling from different traditions and centuries and putting these together. And he'll become even more passionate about that, about mixing something to create a sense of the other, something very interesting, something very exotic in his work after he moves to Paris. And the global for him, and I want to stress this, is born from the community that he surrounds himself with, and we'll talk about the sort of international community of Montparnasse. The other theme that I want to get across through this talk is that he saw himself as a sculptor. And so I'm going to try to sort of promote that understanding that that was always his mentality, and particularly after he moves to France. Here he is studying in Florence, and where he goes, not even in his late teens, and is studying in an atelier and going to the different museums. I should also say that he's very has a compromised health from early on, and eventually it's understood that he has tuberculosis, and this will be his downfall. But we have to understand that he was weakened and would often have to sort of convalesce, both in Italy and in France, and eventually returning home to Italy and going back to Paris. But he had a weakened disposition, and this is something that he dealt with throughout his life. And I think that I'm not the first to say that he had an understanding that he might have a short life, that he lived for the day, and that could manifest itself in feverishly producing or living hedonistically, and it did in both ways. Another thing that he was exposed to, though, back in Italy, were avant-garde currents. So Impressionism, which was still very sort of new, and people were dealing with things and wrestling with this sense of light and almost abstracted forms. And so here we see, even while in Italy, he's producing something that is as current as possible. It looks like anything that the French were producing at this time, and so he's got his finger on the pulse, and he's thinking modern, he's thinking traditional. He comes to France in 1906, or comes to Paris, and settles there. He'll make periodic trips to Italy, back home. He comes again with not a huge stipend, but some money from an uncle and from his family, which continues for a couple of years. So, he's actually more well-to-do than some of his compatriots when he gets there. But he soon takes on, and it's not just a sort of ruse, but a more impoverished stance. He can't hold on to money. He lives like a king for a day and buys drinks for all of his friends, and he doesn't care that he won't have money for clothes or food or whatever. And, known to his friends as someone who looked dashing no matter what. Eventually he sort of settles on a corduroy suit, and it just is almost in tatters, but he puts on a scarf and just, he has a certain elan, and this is what people remark upon. I'm showing you early works that he produces, and I wouldn't know that these are works by Modigliani. Maybe you would. But it is to say, just like a number of artists, like Picasso and others who come to Paris and are trying to find their language in the beginning of the 20th century, who do you look to? You look to Edvard Munch, you look to Expressionism, you look to, the symbolist past of the 1890s. You look to Fauvism, right? And the new works of Matisse that are brightly colored. And so we see here, he's sort of combining some of those strides. I'm not saying these aren't great. If you're looking for a holiday gift for me, I would take any of these works. And I've tried to put the different collections, by the way, that they're in. All kidding aside, they're fantastic, but this isn't what Modigliani becomes known for. So he's grappling with what is going to be his language. Here's another work from that sort of time period, a couple years into his experience in Paris, The Cellist. And again, one might or might not know this is by Modigliani. It certainly looks at and takes language from the work of Cézanne, who passed away in 1906. I'm not saying he's copying or appropriating per se. I'm saying these are models. that become part of his diction, if you will. So here is a black and white photograph, and I love to show color, but here at least it gives us some environment, some context. And if you don't know about La Ruche, or the beehive, this was a fantastic artist residence that a sculptor, a very well-to-do sculptor, had concocted. It's constructed from parts of the 1900 World's Fair in Paris. So he took different sculptures and parts of buildings and brought them together and constructed this essentially really cheap dorms with no, heat and like little spaces for dozens of artists to live for next to nothing. And so Montparnasse became this place where artists were flocking. Montmartre, Utrecht by 1909. So Modigliani finds himself in La Ruche and gets to meet artists like Soutine, Chagall, mentioned earlier, Kissling, Brancusi, and many others. Now, Modigliani won't stay put for very long. He's often kind of living on the street. His friends would remark they would see him in doorways. Part of that was late nights. And part of it was the fact that, he never had money even to pay for this. But it is to say he came into contact with this wonderful international world of Montparnasse. And again, that's one of the sort of themes that I want to get across here, that he is hearing this polyphony, this multiple voices, literally in different languages. There, in Montparnasse, there were two cafes. There was La Dôme and the Rotonde. And you sort of picked your cafe. There were others, but these are the two main ones across the street from each other. And all the artists and poets congregated there. Basically because you could live on a cup of coffee and they wouldn't kick you out, and you could drink later. But the idea is that these were places of discussion, and basically Modigliani lived at La Rotonde for a lot of the time and just spent hour after hour there. But there's a joke that you wouldn't hear any French there because so many of these artists came from other areas, from Eastern Europe. And again, Modigliani's roots were in Spain, but, and then later Italy. But Diego Rivera was there. Fujita was there from Japan. So the accents, the dialects, and the different traditions of art making. And all of these artists sort of starving and trying to push modern art forward. Here are some photographs that were taken by the poet Jean Cocteau, who was a good friend of Modigliani's. And here we have the names of some poets. So if you're not as familiar with them, André Salmon, Max Jacob, and Zarate, who was another artist who came from Chile and lived in the La Ruche. I like to say that modern art happens at the cafes and usually over alcohol. But La Ruche was also a meeting place for these artists to converge and to push each other's boundaries and inspire each other with lots of different sources and forms of expression. And there's Jean Cocteau. Again, I'm going to sort of throw some portraits at us and not deconstruct them so very much. I have to say, first of all, that Jean Cocteau didn't like this portrait very much. But I use this for a couple of different reasons. And that is to say, and it sort of will introduce a number of different portraits of friends and colleagues, particularly artists, that Modigliani came into contact with and was inspired by. But also because Jean Cocteau said, particularly after Modigliani's death, he reminded us of how many portraits Modigliani made, mostly drawings of friends, sometimes for a meal or a glass of wine. Modigliani didn't necessarily like to do commissions very much. That wasn't his favorite thing. He liked to draw and to paint portraits of friends. And so, as Cocteau said, after Modigliani died, Montparnasse was littered with these portraits. Everyone had them in their hands. Everyone had them because Modigliani would give them or, buy a meal with them. They littered the space like leaves that had fallen all over Montparnasse. And again, just to say, Cocteau didn't quite like this one. It just didn't suit him right. There are a number of other drawings that he preferred, but he made sure that this didn't stay in his collection. But I want to introduce us to two other artists that you're probably familiar with. And some of them are through portraits by Modigliani. So on your left here, we have a wonderful portrait of the sculptor Jacques Lipchitz and his wife Berthe. So they were, starving young newlyweds, and they asked Modigliani to paint their portrait. You can see Lipchitz's name perhaps to the side, sort of almost etched in there in sort of primitive writing. Very mask-like faces, and we'll talk about sort of where some of this style comes from. But Lipchitz gave him like 10 francs. And he felt so bad, even though he had no money. He actually told Modigliani it wasn't quite right. He needed, he wanted to give him some more money. So he said, we need to sit for another sitting. Could you fix it up a little bit? Modigliani didn't even really fix it up very much, but I think he appreciated the extra 10 francs because, Jacques Lipchitz said, oh my gosh, it's a double portrait. It's, it's not even what you pay for one portrait. So, and here is Diego Rivera, who you may or may not know was living in Paris for over a decade before he moved back to Mexico, was basically called back to Mexico in 1921 by the Minister of Education or Arts and to paint murals. But Diego Rivera had been spending time since the early 20th century, traveling around Europe and then immersed in the scene in Paris, learning the lessons of Cézanne, here clearly picking up on the cubism of Picasso and Braque, although Diego Rivera gives us a little bit of serape there. He's like, this is a Diego Rivera, and don't you forget it. But I don't know that we would recognize Jacques Lipchitz from either representation, right? Modigliani is all about the sort of mask-like forms, the ovoid faces, the kind of pursed lips. And Diego Rivera has not quite abstracted Lipchitz, made him perhaps a reference to kind of the sculpture, and certainly sort of playing with the Cubist language of faceting and fragmentation. And here are works by Hana Orlov and Jacques Lipchitz, and I put their origins here because I want to not forget. We've got people from the Ukraine, from Lithuania, from Belarus, from again Mexico, and these are examples of people that Modigliani was great friends with and interested in. I think his art looks more like Orlov. He was very good friends with her, and she really tried to sort of promote his art. But Lipchitz, obviously a very good friend, and perhaps Diego Rivera is trying to play on that kind of fragmented, multiple perspective formation in his portrait there. Juan Gris. Good friend of Picasso and Matisse, who had come from Spain. Just again, one of these many artists who immigrated to Paris during this period to make a name for themselves. Came, I think, in 1906, the same time as Modigliani was there. And here, a photograph of Fujita, a very well-known artist in his time, from Japan, rounding out this incredibly global group in Montparnasse. Again, I think they were equalized by the fact that nobody had any money, and they painted and sculpted in many different ways. There was not one defining feature, but we often refer to this group of artists as the School of Paris, an informal school. It wasn't a school. Some of them, like Modigliani, studied it at or went to the studio Colarossi, where you could, for free or for a couple centimes, work with a model. But basically, it was an informal group who all chose to work in whatever way they wanted to. Here is Haim Soutine, a very good friend of Modigliani's, and one of many portraits that Modigliani painted of him, and one of many portraits that Modigliani did of Diego Rivera. I think that sort of robust sensibility comes across in this wonderful drawing. So just to suggest, Modigliani is in the thick of things. Here, even in this black and white picture, we begin to see that by 1912, he's showing at the Salon de Tom, the most sort of contemporary art venue, amidst a number of different artists who are pushing towards, there's Picabia there in particular, but pushing towards a complete abstraction, but there are many different modes of representation. I push us towards the Romanian artist Constantin Brancusi, and here is a drawing of him, probably from about 1912 or so. This is probably the most formative relationship in terms of Modigliani's artwork. So Constantin Brancusi had come at the early part of the century from Romania and worked apprentice under Auguste Rodin, and then said famously, "Nothing grows under the shade of a big tree." And he was right. If he'd stayed as an apprentice to Rodin, he would have been one of many apprentices to Rodin. But instead, he pushed towards a streamlining, finding an essence of form. And that's something that really appealed to Modigliani. And he was a little bit older, so not a father figure, but kind of an older brother. And here we see Brancusi in his studio, and a photo. Brancusi was very selective and liked to take his own photographs of his studio. So here is a photograph which shows us Sleeping Muse and The Kiss, and other works in progress. But one of the things that Brancusi's friendship and practice inspired Modigliani with was the idea of direct carving. And they really appreciated, both of them, that sense, and they didn't always use it, but the idea of directly carving into limestone or marble. Brancusi, of course, deserves his own lecture, and we could talk about the multiple versions and variations and how he would make something in wood and in bronze and in marble, and was searching for the essence in different media and material. I'll show you a few more of his works. So he had his own path, but he and Modigliani were, very good friends, and it nurtured that sculptor spirit in Modigliani and inspired him. So after 1909, we find Modigliani really delving into drawings, and this is The Sleeping Muse and The Kiss by Brancusi. Here are other side view of Brancusi's work. But it fuels the fire that was already there of Modigliani thinking of himself as a sculptor. Now, sculpting is expensive. You have to get materials, and so this was difficult for Modigliani. He often stole building blocks from nearby buildings, and even though they may look old and worn, they're blocks from buildings that were just going up. But it's difficult. And so you do a lot of drawing, and then you prepare for things, and then you carve, and maybe you don't have anybody to buy things. But this is how he wanted himself to be known at this point. And I just want us to see, him carving on this block and a head that's produced by that. And then I want to throw out some, into our view, some of the wonderful sources that he's drawing on. Let me go back to Modigliani for a second. So again, Modigliani is searching for, a sort of essence, and Modigliani looks to Southeast Asian art. And if we look at Mademoiselle Pogenie. So this is a work by Brancusi, but he's looking at temple statues and taking those ovoid eyes and thinking about the beauty and strength and power of other cultures' traditions. And again, Modigliani will reach towards this and think about otherness. Now, remember that Modigliani is a Jew, and this hadn't really been an issue for him in Livorno. That was very sort of integrated, and I'm reducing things, but as Modigliani says, no one ever showed him any prejudice or any difference there. It was very sort of cosmopolitan, and when he got to Paris, that's the first time. This is, following post-Dreyfus affair and the sort of riff in French culture between the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards. And, who knows if that ever even really healed. But certainly at this time, it was still fast and furious and difficult. And something that's very interesting about Modigliani is being so very cultured, being fluent in French, he immediately could have been assimilated in French culture. No one necessarily knew. And he chose to, because he was very proud of his heritage, and rightly so, that when he began to buck up against prejudice or to see it, against his friends or in society, in the papers, he was very adamant to declare, "Hi," or "Bonjour, I'm Modigliani, and I'm a Jew." So he didn't make it easy for himself. Certainly it was easier among this crowd from all over, and certainly among Jews from different locations. But it was a stance he took, not just as a modernist, but to say, I am other here. What do you make of that? I'm Italian, and I'm Jewish, and I'm here. So I want to be clear that that was part of his identity from the get-go, that he was very adamant about it, and that in engaging in these forms of otherness and culling from them, wedding them together, that his identity is a part of that, or the notion of a very identity. What is portraiture? Do we put it on like a mask? So I started to say there are multiple sources, and again, he's looking at Brancusi's art, which blends together, centuries and traditions. He's seeing works of art, and you might say, well, where did he see these? Well, just like Brancusi, he could see these works of art at the Louvre. While this may be at the Metropolitan Museum, he could see Cycladic art. I'm just using that as an example. But he went to the Louvre, as did many artists, and studied the Egyptian galleries, the Cycladic, very early Greek galleries. He could see things at the Ethnographic Museum. And again, divisions of culture and race and people was not very PC. Is it today? I'll leave that in the air. But this idea of I'm lumping this together in a sense that one could go to this museum or that museum, and some were considered objects and some were considered art, but he and Matisse and Picasso and others were searching for a language that was powerful and strong, or many, to bring together. So when we look at this Cycladic figure, I hope that we can see how Modigliani is drawing on these with the triangular noses, so very elongated, simplified, stylized, the small, teeny eyes, no eyes at all. And these become markers in his work. By the way, and I shouldn't leave out a few important people in his life, and there were many, but Modigliani, attractive as he was, had many friends, and again, charming person. But one woman who doesn't get enough sort of discussion is Beatrice Hastings, a poet. So he loved to surround himself by poets, male and female, and he had several very dear friends, sometimes romantic, sometimes not, women, who, unrequited, I should say, but loved wordplay, loved intellectual discussion, and loved the female form. Yeah, take that where you will. But here is but one picture of Madame de Pompadour, but Madame de Pompadour, that's what he called her. It was a nickname for her. It's Beatrice Hastings. There we see her again in photograph, and then we see her sort of in this fantastic hat, not meant to replicate the one next to it, but to have a bit of fun. Madame Pompadour, he doesn't call her Madame de Pompadour, he's just sort of playing on her name. She was quite the character, I should say, but I want to just point out this kind of stylized nose and elongated face that comes out of looking at things like Cycladic art. She and he had a tumultuous relationship for a couple of years. She was a bit older than him, and they were well matched in terms of their charisma and their daring. One time she walked through Paris with very little clothing, but a basket of ducks. I guess you've all done that before. It doesn't, get much response. But anyway, it is to say, they were very much part of La Vie Bohème, and for the mid part of the teens, they were very much an item. But I want to just quickly illuminate some more of these wonderful sources. And again, it's not appropriation per se, it's a dialogue. And these stand for, any of these drawings and sculptures stand for any number of works, hundreds of works. And again, you can see many, many of these at the Jewish Museum exhibition. But we can see, again, sources coming to the fore in terms of the ovoid eyes or the patterned hair or the long necks. Here is a Caryatid, and I'll have several pictures of this in sculpture. Actually, one of the last sculptures that he does. And this also brings me to the notion that, or back to that notion that he was a sculptor at heart. So these drawings that he produces again and again of heads and these sort of lyrical nudes, ancient nudes, hybrid nudes, it all speaks to his love of sculpture and his interest in the plasticity of these ancient forms. It's no wonder that we're looking at sculpture, right? It's three-dimensional. He's looking for forms that can inform shapes, styles that can inform his own three-dimensional art. I love the sort of being able to see it in two-dimension and three-dimension. Caryatids, might be a word that you use all the time, or it might not be. But, in this lexicon, it means it's almost a type of architectural furniture. These are figurines that are supportive. They are sculptural, but they are part of the architecture. So I brought in, for instance, a kind of source, the Caryatids from the Erechtheion. And when you go over to London to go to the Tate, to see the Modigliani show there, after you see the one at the Jewish Museum, why don't you take a trip to Greece? So you can see this in the flesh. But there are many of these temples have these Caryatid type figures in different ways. They also exist in different cultures. So he's combining that together and thinking about it. Now, when we look at his Caryatid, it's supposed to look much like a lot of Brancusi's work, worn and old, and it's timeless. We're not supposed to be able to figure out when it came from exactly. There we have it again, and many drawings that he did related to it. And I'm actually going to show you, this is a MoMA installation from not too long ago. They've changed this now, but you can see one of his nudes and one of his nude Caryatids. But he's really thinking about this ancient sculpture and the body represented in ancient art. The face is broken off. It actually fell. Not at MoMA, but it fell when it was in a studio. I mean, again, imagine how hard it is to move these forms, and you're broke, and it got broken, but then he liked it because it added that sense of like ruins and antiquity. But you can see the kind of shelving on there. You can see the sort of distorted forms. I mean, it makes me want to kind of crouch down, and we see the strength and power of those legs there. And this at least it gives a sense more of the dimensionality. And, being that I'm speaking to this idea that this was a passion to create these heads and these bodies that could speak a fluid language of time, I want us to see some of that dimensionality. But to just point out some of the other sources of his, he too is reaching across, and I'm sorry I don't have more specifics on this one, this is a work from the Met actually, or at the Met, but across Southeast Asian, Indian, Tibetan works, again, that would have been on display. And here we see, I just wanted to show more of that fluidity of the body and how that Caryatid drawing there by Modigliani borrows both from the fluidity and languidity of this gorgeous sculpture, but it also might be the line of Botticelli or the attenuated forms of mannerism, and they're brought together in really beautiful ways. Just more examples of the sort of closed eyes or the calm face or the mask-like experience. Before I go from that, I should say African art was an enormous an enormous inspiration for all of the European artists of the early 20th century. So Matisse and Picasso around 1906, the very time that Modigliani arrives in France, are being introduced to African art, which you could get at the flea market or see in the Trocadero. And we think about the Demoiselles d'Avignon and the oceanic sort of masks and the African masks, or in a number of Matisse's work, they're very mask-like, or the German expressionists like Kirchner were drawing on this idea of masks as a way of getting away from likeness, or the pretty, or the classical. And again, gaining sort of power and strength and maybe sort of a talismanic quality. And Modigliani feeds into that and pushes ever forward with these mask-like faces. Here is a photograph of Modigliani and Jean Houbertin, who was his last paramour, or officially so, and essentially his common law wife. And there they are in the studio. And I show you a photograph of her. She was an artist in her own right, a bit younger than him. They met when she was in the studio, in a school that he attended classes in, I should say. She was willing to live with him in a kind of haphazard existence, but also when she met him in the last couple years of his life, his star began to rise. So they were able to go to the south of France together while he was convalescing, and they returned to Paris together when he unfortunately died. But there she is with her striking looks, and she was very good at managing their household on a shoestring, even as the money began to come in. As I told you, Dedo, Modigliani, was not very good about managing money, even as his works began to be purchased. I'll have it alongside a portrait there with all of the sort of, I think now we can see the hybridity of these many different sources that Modigliani was interested in. We see that telltale, very elongated triangular nose, the kind of ovoid eyes, and the sourcils, the eyebrows that were not only in fashion, in vogue in Paris at the time, but come out of ancient sculpture, and of course the pursed lips, which too are a very fashionable thing in Paris at the time. He did nudes of her as well, or in semi-dress. But we have this wonderful, it's an incredibly modern picture there with the chair to one side and the sort of furniture in the background, but like a Cézanne, things don't quite add up, and her body is sort of pulled and stretched, like a modern-day Mannerist portrait. And this stands for many that he did of her and the portraits he's doing of the time. And here we see that, in this sort of stretch there, that's another portrait of, it says head of a woman, but it's Jean Houbertin, that, this idea of Egyptian influence and Cycladic influence, and there we have an African mask, all sort of brought together in the portraits that he's making at this time. So here is a photo of Modigliani's dealer. He actually had a couple of different dealers. He had some patrons and a couple of dealers, including Paul Guillaume, but eventually Leopold Zabrowski basically takes over and is supporting Modigliani at the end of his life. Modigliani actually has a one-man show in 1917, which is more than I can say for Picasso and Matisse, because in fact during wartime things were very difficult. The show was shut down, by the way, because the nudes shown in the window at Berthweil's gallery were considered offensive. They had pubic hair and underarm hair, and they were just too shallow, too warm, and too provocative whatever we think of his nudes. And the police actually stationed across the street, they were, said you have to take all those out or we'll shut you down, which they did for a long time, several hours, and then the show went on. But it is to say Modigliani was gaining a certain acceptance at the end of his life. And right before he died, he had an enormous show in London, which he was unable to attend because of his health. But I show us here Leopold Zabrowski there in this wonderful photograph in which we see an African sculpture. And I'm collapsing African art here. Of course, there are masks from the Dongan region and the Fang people and different meanings and different symbolism, much of which Modigliani didn't know, wasn't aware of, Picasso wasn't aware of, etc. But it is to say they felt these forms were powerful and liberating and got rid of traditional perspective and they were expressive and so, the fact that we see a Modigliani painted on the wall or door behind Zabrowski reminds us very much that Modigliani was creating environments and spaces, and that it was very much in dialogue with these different other artistic traditions. In fact, one of his dealers told Modigliani he should collect African art if he could to kind of feed off its sense of originality and power. And here's a portrait of Zabrowski in 1919. Again, as portraits go, I think we have the sort of ovoid face. I think we have rehearsed all of the kind of elongation, etc. But it's to stand as a portrait of a colleague and friend, of which there were so many, as I mentioned, about Cocteau sharing with us. But speaking of how many portraits Modigliani did during his time, Zabrowski was the one who said to Modigliani, first of all, you don't like doing commissions, and you can't just live for alcohol or food, right, by these drawings. And when you make a portrait, the only person who's going to buy it is the sitter or the sitter's mother. So you need to do more nudes. Right? Not just the Caryatids, but actual nudes. And so, this is around 1916, Modigliani begins really investing in the nude. He painted more portraits than anything else. And I should also say, because I'm talking about painting now, Modigliani, as much as he loved sculpture, in 1914, he really gives it up. It's too hard to get any of these blocks. And also, I mentioned his tuberculosis, which it may be that carving the dust, kicking it up, was just too difficult. I mean, his health was really, really compromised, and the sort of strength to carry on with this, and also not being able to get supplies during World War I. Fortunately, Brancusi was able to keep sculpting, but Modigliani really turned to drawing and painting. But it was Zabrowski who said, you gotta do nudes. That's what people will buy. But I just couldn't resist reminding us of these kind of influences, many of them behind these pictures here. So we have a wonderful African mask there. Zabrowski gave a stipend for Modigliani. He purchased his works, he sold them, he dealt in them, but he also allowed Modigliani to, basically told him he had to go to the south of France to convalesce in 1919 because Modigliani was, on his deathbed. Modigliani is revived a bit, Jean goes down for a while. By the way, I should say Jean has, during this period, Jean gives birth to Modigliani's child, named Jean. A girl, and there may be some other children floating around, but with Jean, so Jean has a little baby in tow, and eventually they make it back to Paris, and this is when there's a big show in London, but things are very difficult. Here, I should have shown us this, but one example of a nude painting that Zabrowski would have sort of pushed, and the kind of nude that was considered so offensive when it was shown in Berthel's window. There were many models. Jean probably didn't pose for something quite as provocative as this. And I mentioned the models in terms of Modigliani's sort of romantic life and of course the sort of lore of artists and their models in sexual liaison. Some of that was true, some of it wasn't. But I want to draw our attention just to the sort of beauty and modernity of works like this, particularly this one in which the background is very sort of rough-hewn and abstracted. But again, the way in which Modigliani included features of the nude that some other artists wouldn't dare do, that were considered not acceptable, such as the different hair, but also the way in which he's cropped the body. And I want us to think about this in relation to those caryatids and that sort of fluid nature. I return to Jean Cocteau and say, one time Jean Cocteau, and of course he said this in French, but he said, Modigliani's line has the alacrity of a Siamese cat. I don't really know what that means, but it sounds good. And I think that when we look at works like this, there is something about that sort of fluidity, and charm that Modigliani had, in which he was able to create this body that is both the model in front of him and all of these sources that are brought together. So, again, I need to draw us to a close. There's much more that we could look at or to think about, but I want to bring him to this point in which he's creating both portraits and a lot of nudes. He's beginning to sell, but he can't enjoy this very much. I sort of downplayed his life in the cafe. I want to stress again this conviviality, this congeniality, this appreciation for other artists, this intermingling among this international community, the way in which he looked at Picasso's art and said, damn it, he's 10 years ahead of anybody else. How do I capture that, right? So this was a growing process, a learning process, a process of, and a time of asserting his self. Again, his Jewish identity, his artistic identity, his Italian identity. But, things caught up with him. We have this self-portrait there in which he looks rather famished and weakened, and that he certainly was. But he's also trying to, like many artists, kind of put himself in the tradition of artists with the self-portrait. When you show yourself with the palette at the canvas from which he turns away, he's thinking about Cézanne, he's thinking about Poussin, he's thinking about Velázquez and other artists who've charted their careers and shown themselves as serious artists. He may not be ready to go, but unfortunately he was. This is the last photograph taken before his death on January 24th. And at the end, he still couldn't manage his means. He was in his freezing studio apartment with Jean. Apparently, the tuberculosis had overcome him, the tubercular meningitis. And, he was near coma, and Jean just stayed there. She was very, very pregnant with their second child and unwilling to sort of face this. And though there had been people who were supposed to sort of look after them, other artists and people in the building, it was a convergence, a perfect storm of people being away and all of that. And it wouldn't have helped anyway. As I said, he was constantly sort of coughing and had come to the end of his rope. It didn't help that he did a lot of drugs, that he abused his body, that he drank a lot. But it may very well also be that he drank to cover up the tuberculosis, because nobody would hang out with you, nobody would be with you. You would be completely ostracized, as many people were, if you had tuberculosis, if you were coughing. But if you could mitigate it, if you could drink enough to calm your system, then people wouldn't know. People in his very small circle probably knew, but it's very likely that he wasn't a raging drunk all of the time. I just sort of say that because I think we need to think about all of the lore and the sort of myth of Modigliani and how big that gets. It is a tragic, short life, but I think there also, we think about this poet soul and this man, this intellectual who thrived on discussion, thrived on art, thrived on his friends, loved his art more than anything else, but gave his soul to this. And likely he did know that he would die early of tuberculosis. Certainly he knew when he painted this picture. went into the hospital, pauper's hospital, slipped into coma and died. His friends tried to make a death mask, but they had never made one before, so that didn't turn out very well. But I want to sort of leave us with a more positive notion of Dedo, as he was called. Attractive, aristocratic, convivial, among friends here at a tavern with soldiers, but apparently he could entertain anyone. He was the life of the party, interesting to anyone, and I think, made Montparnasse what it was, and certainly thrived off of the international community, and certainly the Jewish community of Montparnasse that gave him a home in a way that he never had felt in the same way in Livorno. So, adieu, Dedo. Cheers. So, I know I've kept us long. I just wanted to have you see, if you can still see, a recommended reading. A book that I very much enjoy is the biographer Meryl Seacrest, who is not an art historian, but a biographer and a historian. And there are many books on Modigliani. You can't go wrong. The best thing to do is to see his art or to see it again. But I particularly like Seacrest's Modigliani A Life, which was published in 2011. So thank you so much for coming out. I should also, as a prologue, say that when Modigliani was dying, he said to his dealer, Zabrowski, I know you don't like him very much, but when I leave you, I'm going to give you Soutine. And he promoted Soutine, and Zabrowski took on Soutine, and that made Soutine's career.